a bear cub approached a man with desperate eyes, pleading with him to save its mother. But what transpired next? The fierce Montana wind howling through the snow-covered pines is a heartwarming moment that will surprise and warm your heart, bringing with it the burden of loneliness that, at 52, John Whitaker had come to both fear and love his aged visage. Heard tales of a guy who found comfort in the rhythm of chopping after choosing solitude over the bustle of city life, timber, and caring for his little hens. His cottage situated on the brink of enormous prosperity. His wish to leave the world he was familiar with was demonstrated by his decision, responding to his illness, to leave behind everything that had any resonance. John couldn't get rid of the sensation that morning when frost painted exquisite designs on his window panes. The woodland was normally alive with the soft rustle of branches and the far-off cries of wildlife, had a peculiar stillness. So he grabbed his heavy wool coat and pulled it on. If this narrative captivated you, he took his axe and strode out into the cool morning air, his boots crunching against the fresh snow. Please remember to like and subscribe to our channel and let us know where city you're viewing from. We'll continue. 20 years ago, when he was a successful National Geographic animal photographer, catching events that stunned many, but following a string of personal disappointments and a mounting sense of disenchantment with the practice of animal photography, he wandered off course because he didn't know what else to do. He had fled the modern world and established a home in this isolated area of Montana. The city beached where he lived and gave him comfort from time to time, and his brown building afforded him comfort and privacy, where the intricacies of human society dissipated into the straightforward realities of Montana. Like old photos, the coveted wards, the magazine covers, and dust in a box beneath his bed, they passed through his head that formerly had his name, and the connections he had left behind all appeared to be from a different era. He had discovered a new kind of purpose here, between the towering pines and ancient rocks, the music that broke the silence. In contrast to what he had heard throughout his years in the desert, his reflection was not the well-known cry of a wolf by the break of the day. Instead, the sound of a wolf pack howling or an eagle pierced the morning air like a jaw, froze his axe, knife frantic, primal, and clearly in pain. His instincts, refined by years of experience in the wild, were suspended mid-swing as the echo echoed through the trees. All he could do was focus on treading cautiously, yet something in that cry resonated with a deeper aspect of him, a section that had previously waited in darkness for hours in order to use his lens to get the ideal moment of natural drama. Without realizing it, he found himself approaching the sound's origin with deliberate, slow steps. With each stride, the trail took him farther away from the security of his familiar surroundings. Through a labyrinth of snow-covered bush, pathways, the cry approached once again, and a deep, menacing roar that told him that it was a large and patient man after all. He heard a cracking noise above his head. As he forced his way through a dense clump of pine branches, the hair on the back of his neck sprang up. Entered a tiny area and realized right away how serious the situation was. A huge black bear with snow-covered fur was imprisoned in a vicious steel jaw trap. Beside her, a tiny cub wailed and pressed against its mother's side, its muscular limbs trapped in its ruthless grasp. John's eyes widened in terror as the picture hit him like a physical blow, not only because respectable, possible distress signs crowded up around her face, but because half her stomach was removing, despite the animal's evident distress. The mother understood that these traps were forbidden in this area of the forest. When Bear's eyes met John's, he saw something that would alter the trajectory of his life. Pain. Indeed, but also a clever appeal that went beyond the inherent division between humans and animals. The cub, unaware of the seriousness of their situation, the young creature, barely mature enough to live independently, nuzzled against its mother's side. As John weighed his alternatives, time seemed to slow down. His years of experience with wildlife informed him that it was suicidal to approach a bear that was hurt and trapped, but it was also equally suicidal to abandon them to their destiny. As the snow started to fall more thickly around him, He understood that it was impossible, and that his days of seeing nature through a lens at this time required activity rather than documentation. He was unaware at the time that this choice would force him to return to a world he had attempted to escape, behind leaving him to face not just the wilderness's perils, but also the lyricisms. He put down his axe and started to compile a lengthy list of the intricate network of human relationships he had avoided for years. John Whitaker had no way of knowing that his meticulously crafted solitude was about branches that could be used as levers, to be broken in ways he never would have thought possible, the bear observing his every action and growing more menacing as he moved around the clearing. But there was also a desperate apprehension in her expression, that while John started to devise a strategy to liberate the magnificent, this human might be their only hope of surviving raw. He noticed fresh tracks in the snow, but they weren't those of an animal. Rather, they were human. This trap was recently placed, and the person would probably come back to inspect it. As the sound of branches breaking behind him caused John to swivel around in the falling snow, as he considered his next course of action, saw a stranger walking toward a woman wearing a Forest Service outfit, her hand warily resting on her tranquilizer. Pistol. Their gazes locked, and neither of them took a step away. Slowly, she yelled out, "My name is Sarah Collins Fish, and I'm calm but authoritative, John." Wildlife Service John lifted his hands to indicate he intended no harm, discovered them in this manner, pointing to the ensnared bear and her young. "I was going to try to release her," Sarah said, as she evaluated the circumstances. Her black hair changed from a suspicious to a professional interest. Her face displayed the worn experience of someone who had spent years in the field, and she was pulled back in a sensible braid. With the smoothness of a seasoned wildlife officer, she advanced into the forest, her boots barely making a sound. She clarified, kneeling in the new snow, saying, "I've been monitoring illegal trapping activity in this area for weeks. This is the third bear I've found this month, so investigate the trap while keeping a safe distance from the injured bear." She stopped to examine the trap's mechanism, and this is the first time we've caught them. These aren't amateur traps. The mother bear roared weakly, her power clearly waning, and the cub sensed that someone knew precisely what they were doing. Sarah noticed that its mother's enthusiasm had changed, and she started to cry more loudly. "I've done this before." And she moved quickly and effectively as she reached into her pack and produced a set of specialist tools. Isabel remarked, looking at Jonk with alarm, "But I'll need your assistance because these traps need..." She gave him a thick leather protection jacket, which at least 2 persons could securely open without further harming the animal. "Wear this sleeve. If something goes wrong, it could be your sole defense against those claws." Together, John found himself examining Sarah's face. There was a recognizable quality to her resolute look. He was reminded of someone from his past by the way she handled herself during a crisis. He made a concerted effort to forget that you were once a wildlife photographer, didn't you? As they positioned themselves on each side of the trap, Sarah asked abruptly, "I recognized your name and your work on the..." For a time, JK's hands froze because Yellowstone wolf packs were revolutionary. It had been years since anyone had brought up his past life, which was a long time ago, he said softly. Concentrating on the current job while practicing synchronization, they were able to... The mother bear appears to comprehend their objectives in order to generate sufficient leverage to start opening the trap's jaws. Antonisa stayed remarkably motionless, but her gaze never left her youngster. When the strain on her leg started to lessen, she released a sigh. Sarah urged her voice to remain calm despite the strain, when she heard a faint sigh that seemed to reverberate through the clearing. Almost there. The bear pulled her injured leg free after the trap finally let go after a little more. But rather than running away, her cub quickly pressed against her in an attempt to provide warmth and comfort. But she stayed where she was, too weak to move. Sarah saw that she was taking medical supplies out of her pack since she had lost a lot of blood, and as this weather moved in, she looked up at the sky, which was growing darker with heavy snow clouds. Yet John understood what she was implying, before she said it, and his cabin was the only way to survive out here, not in this state. With a shelter just a few kilometers away and the temperature fast lowering, the idea of taking a wounded wild bear into his house looked ridiculous, but he couldn't help but nod. "I have a storage shed attached to my cabin," he said, adding that it's insulated. Sarah's eyes brightened with approval. "So, we may try it, but we'll need more. We need to act quickly, because the weather is going to get much worse, and other people are also interested in these bears as they started." Sarah provided additional information on the inquiry in order to get ready for the difficult task of transferring the injured bear. Reports of organized wildlife trafficking in the area had surfaced during her research, but the intricacy of the traps indicated that the offenders were professionals, notwithstanding their evasive behavior. Sarah acknowledged, "I've been working on this case for months," as they constructed a makeshift stretcher out of a junk coat and several strong branches, but they seem to disappear into thin air whenever we approach. It's as if they are familiar with the forest as we do. The ramifications of her remarks lingered in the atmosphere, suggesting that someone was observing a person who was familiar with these woods as they carefully moved the wounded bear onto the stretcher with the cub just behind them. With the cub just behind them, Jen couldn't get rid of the sensation that they were being watched while the snow fell. As they started the difficult journey back to his lodge, the bear's weight made it harder and faster to hide their traces. Every step was difficult, and the cub's anxious entourage made things more difficult for them. But something else was developing between John and Sarah, a collaboration that started off as a need, but developed into something more intricate. "Why did you leave?" Sarah asking abruptly, disrupting the cadence of their deliberate motions. "I'm referring to your photographs. We reached the peak of your field." J.N. stayed quiet for a while, concentrating on getting his bearings in the deepening night. At last, he spoke over the snow, his voice scarcely heard over the wind at times. "Sometimes we have to decide between recording life and living it, Sarah, since the stories we record become too personal." Appeared to comprehend that there was more to his response, but she chose not to pursue it because they had more pressing issues. As they got closer to Bear's cabin, John noticed that his health was getting worse and the storm was getting stronger. His life of isolation was about to drastically change, but he was unaware that Sarah Collins' presence would prove to be a bigger disturbance than the injured bear they carried on their first morning together. John's well-planned existence was put to the test when the injured bear and her cub appeared in the storage shed. He had spent the night setting up fresh hay because the temporary animal housing needed ongoing care. By maintaining a steady temperature while closely monitoring the mother bear's health, Sarah had, before leaving to get further medical supplies, they left thorough instructions outlining how to clean the bear. However, still cautious, appeared to grasp their intention when she wound and applied the herbal pusses she had made. When John came to, she would snarl gently to get aid, but she let him treat her wounded paw with unexpectedly patient. The cub, however, displayed no such restraint and active in spite of the situation, exploring every area of the shed, toppling tools and looking around. John was so excited about the hay bales that he found himself alternating between worrying about the mother's recuperation and laughing at the cub's antics. His daily schedule had to change to make room for his new visitors every morning. Started by feeding his hens, which clucked uneasily as they became aware of their new neighbors. John had to fortify their coop to make sure they were secure whenever the cub's cries could be heard coming from the shed. Was there something strangely fulfilling about this new duty? A feeling of direction he hadn't known? He'd noticed a new footprints in the snow surrounding his hut that morning while inspecting the bear's bandages. They were bigger, fashioned with hefty boots, and they went around the property before vanishing into the forest. He was chilled by the finding, which had nothing to do with the chilly air someone had been breathing. He was locking the shed door while keeping an eye on his cabin at night when Sarah brought back her truck full of medical supplies. Supplies and tracking devices. She instantly saw his worried countenance and asked him what was happening. Her face and the footsteps became serious as she continued. "They're getting bolder," kneeling. "To investigate the tracks, which are likely new and likely from this morning, they are searching for the bears together." Sarah had taken the necessary veterinary supplies, into the chalet, this time antibiotics. As they arranged the goods in the J&K kitchen, they used fresh bandages and improved instruments to heal the bear's wound. She pulled out a map of the town and described what she had discovered, saying that there was a pattern to these traps. Someone has been researching the bear's travel patterns in the area, focusing on particular. She indicated a number of designated spots where they may see moms with cubs, and your cottage is located in one of them. John looked at the map in the midst of their operation zone, identifying the markings from his daily walks that he had never observed anything unusual previously. But he hadn't been monitoring his tranquil life in the woods, which had made his complacency oblivious to the more sinister acts occurring around him. Cub's amusing grunts brought them back to the shed, where they could see it trying to scale the hay through the window. Bales kept falling, but its mother watched with what appeared to be frustration as it did so. Sarah noticed that her damaged paw, which was carefully tucked into the little pouch she wore in her belt, had lost a substance that cannot be replaced. The quiver had stopped, and she seemed to concentrate on her mother. The bales kept falling. Under her was healing nicely. "I'm grinning more than I anticipated at the scene. Your concern has helped." Her countenance darkened as she turned to face John. "But we must be cautious of those who lay these traps. Professionals like them won't give up lightly, especially now that we've meddled in their business." As though to highlight her point, a sound from a distance reverberated through the trees, and Sarah and John were abruptly cut off by an engine. Looked at each other. Someone close was observing and waiting. They spent the final afternoon adding new cameras to their setup. In the afternoon, they moved the vassals to their peds. As expected, Sarah led Sarah down to the front porch and sat her down on the motion-sensitive cameras throughout the property in the afternoon. Sarah looked at each other. Someone close was observing any questionable conduct he saw while in the woods. Proved useful since they concealed the devices from casual observers and selected the ideal spots for optimal coverage. Watch as the snow started to fall again in big flakes as dusk drew near. Swiftly obscured their footprints and the tools they had set up, and the forest fell silent. That unique type of silence. It comes with a lot of snow. JN made them both a basic supper of bread and soup. While Sarah made one final check on the bears, she proposed that we alternate watching tonight during dinner. "I don't believe in this weather they'll attempt anything, but we can't be too cautious," she said, pausing to examine Junk's face till. "When you moved out here, you didn't sign up for this. You want me to tackle it alone." JN glanced out his window, looked the snow falling, reflecting on how his tranquil existence had been completely turned upside down in a matter of days. Yet, as he observed the observing cub playing in the shed outside the window, he came to the realization that sometimes life's windows display more clarities than text or verses tell. When we least expect it, the greatest things happen. "I'll take first watch," he merely getting up to add more wood to the stove. The cabin was filled with the comforting barrier created by the fire against the chilly night and any threats that could be present in the shadows. Outside, the snow kept on. The following morning, the fall covered the wilderness in a pure white blanket that was equal parts beautiful and dangerous. Caused the weather to change. The snow had ceased, revealing a pristine countryside that gleamed beneath the feeble sun. Jan got up early as usual in the winter light to start his morning ritual because the chickens needed to be fed. And now, when he went outside, the crisp air filled his lungs, bringing with it a heightened awareness of the bears that he needed to manage. The mother bear was becoming more conscious of his surroundings, and his health was gradually becoming better. Because of Sarah's medical knowledge and John's careful attention, her wound was healing without infection. The bear's eyes, once clouded with pain and fear, but now displayed a growing trust. The cub became more confident when John came with food and fresh water. Since its mother's recuperation, it had grown more playful and frequently tried to follow John wherever he went. The second watch was taken by Sarah, who had spent the night in John's spare room. As John completed checking on the cottage, she came out with 2 steaming cups of coffee and gave one to him. She inquired, "Is there any movement during your watch?" Her breath was evident in the cold. "Nothing particularly noticeable in the morning air," John said. gladly receiving the coffee, but listen to the typical morning chorus of birds as they stand in quiet for a time this morning. The woodland feels different, was conspicuously lacking, and even the wind appeared to pause its breath. Something had changed. Sarah nodded. She brought her out, and I was also concerned, since the fauna is too quiet. We should examine the security cameras after scanning the tree line using binoculars. When they looked over the footage from the previous night inside the cabin, the majority of the cameras revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Occasionally a rabbit or deer would go through, but one camera on the far side of John's land had recorded something intriguing, a quick burst of light in the early morning hours that might be a signal that hunters are utilizing AN-recommended flashlights. But Sarah shook her head, indicating that the pattern is intentional. She rewound the video, carefully examining it. And they are chatting in 3 brief flashes followed by 2 lengthy ones. Extend the scope of our search. They're organizing something, and I'd like to know what they did in the morning. Installing more cameras around the property's perimeter, Sarah taught John how to spot indications of disturbance. He had previously ignored human activities that had moved moss off rocks and snapped twigs at unusual heights. Tiny clues that someone had recently visited while they were working. Sarah taught more about her. She clarified by attaching a camera on a tree trunk that these aren't your typical hunters. They're very skilled. They are well organized, research animal behavior and migration patterns, and are aware of when and where to place their traps to get the most impact. John reflected on his years spent in the bush and how he had survived so calmly, but I should have heard more from him when this action was happening around him. Don't blame yourself, he said to Sarah, softly patting his arm. They're experts at staying hidden. This is the reason this case has been so difficult. Whenever we approach them, they seem to disappear into thin air. In the cabin, they discovered that the cub was playing in the snow after squeezing through a tiny opening in the shed door. The scene would have been endearing if baby had been rolling and falling as its mother stared nervously through the window. As they carefully led the cub back inside, Sarah remarked, "Not for their current situation, we need to be more careful," possibly keeping an eye out for a chance, as the remainder of the day was devoted to strengthening the security of the shed. John's natural instincts for wilderness and creating a more regimented schedule for the bears' care, as they strive to make the land more secure while maintaining its natural appearance. Survival proven to be crucial. Affected, Sarah got a call on her radio as darkness drew near, so she stepped in. Another trap was discovered roughly 10 miles north of here, so I went outside to take it back, with a distressed look. This one was more advanced than the others, and John's questions stoked the flames in the wood stove with sensors and electronic parts that are increasing their functionality. Nevertheless, she hesitated, carefully selecting her next words. "John, I have a question for you. Would you mind helping? Your land is in a good location, and you are familiar with these woods, so I set up a more permanent observation post here, superior to everyone." And the question took him by surprise, because he had kept his solitude for years, keeping the world at arm's length. But now he was being urged to get involved with it once more, to join something greater than his peaceful life. Before he could respond to a noise coming from the shed, the bear's low warning growl, which they had learned to identify as her warning sign, was drawing their attention. They hurried to the window to check the increasing twilight, because they sensed something was amiss, and there stood at the edge of the clearing. A big moose's breath was apparent in the chilly air, yet something about its behavior seemed strange. It appeared to be too motionless. Sarah, concentrating on the cabin, reached for her binoculars to get a better look. "That's no ordinary moose," she said, looking at how the moose stayed in a state of profound quiet, as someone used it as cover for observation. "You're right." The experience left them both frozen in place for a few minutes, before eventually turning and vanishing into the jungle. Shaken not by the observer's presence, but by the ingenuity of their strategies, they are drawing nearer. As darkness fell, John made his tranquil decision, and Sarah whispered softly, They're more resourceful than we thought. Neither Sarah nor the bears had yet to disturb the wilderness's way of life, although by the knowledge that, if he might assist in protecting his beloved forest, it held deeper secrets than he had thought. Perhaps he was meant to be here, in order to protect the sacredness of this location and protect these creatures. The days that followed settled into a tense rhythm at John's cabin, where every morning started with a careful inspection of the grounds. The mother bear's strength was returning as a result of caring for the bears and continuing with their daily schedule. Progressively, and she was now able to support her damaged body, the cub's playful energy had turned into a source of potential between happiness and worry. Its spirit of adventure made it more difficult for Sarah to keep it hidden. She blended in perfectly with the cabin's everyday routine, giving John's lonely life a new perspective. Along with her professional experience, she brought a strong commitment to wildlife conservation that connected with his personal bond with the forest. And together, they created a method to keep an eye on the neighborhood. One clear morning, while tending to their wounded visitors and inspecting the security cameras, they found unusual patterns in the snow were captured on camera by a number of the gadgets, including perfectly straight lines that wildlife tripwires couldn't have created. Sarah clarified after looking at the photographs carefully. They installed an early warning system around us, and she dispersed. Her map, which shows the locations of the fresh discoveries, is on the kitchen table. John examined the pattern as they formed a circle in an attempt to keep an eye on our movements without approaching too closely. He pointed to an ancient hunting trail here, recalling all the trails and natural features in the area. Although it's now overgrown, a gap in their monitoring coverage could allow someone familiar with these woods to come close enough. Sarah's eyes glowed with curiosity as she entered the cabin without anyone noticing. "Could you show me? Aid in our comprehension of their strategy?" They refrained from going until midday, when the winter sun was at its strongest. Unless you knew where to look, the old trail was hardly discernible outside, weaving through thick vegetation and surrounding trees. As they strolled past enormous boulder formations, John found himself imparting wisdom gathered over years of ghost tours. He clarified that the villagers used to refer to this single journey as the Ghost Trail. It follows natural features that conceal movement, low points, and identifies small marks engraved into aged trees. In the days of the frontier, trappers used it to check their lines in the dense vegetation. Sarah used her GPS to record the coordinates without being noticed, and her professional manner occasionally gave way to sincere awe at the forest's obscure past. "This is amazing, John. No, it's no wonder they've been so difficult to find. They're merging classic methods with new ones." Unfortunately, their investigation was cut short when they heard branches cracking in the distance, and echoing sounds behind them appeared to be human. They froze and listened carefully as the sound approached once more. This time, with the John muttered that there was a noticeable snuffling of a big beast behind that fallen spruce. Pointing to a nearby tree, they huddled behind it and observed a huge bull elk appeared into a tiny clearing where the animal stopped to check the air quality before moving on. Another scout, Sarah, asked out loud once, "How come it's done with such an odd purpose?" Jonathan shook his head, saying, "No, this isn't the elk that passed like the moose from yesterday. Genuine examination of its song's organic movement patterns." But it's encouraging to see, as they headed back to the cottage, Sarah talked more about herself because the wildlife has been too quiet recently. Background: she was raised in a ranger's household and learned to read forest signs as a child. Dad used to say that if you know how to listen, the woods will always reveal the truth. The mention of family triggered. According to John's recollection, my grandfather worked as a forest ranger and taught me the most of what I know. Their discourse was interrupted when they mentioned that these mountains had secrets that the contemporary world had forgotten. Shortly after receiving an important radio call, Sarah answered it, her face becoming serious as she listened. With worry in her eyes, she turned to John after turning off the radio. They discovered other traps, all of which had been disarmed. Suddenly, it's not like them to stop using their equipment. She thought about the consequences for a moment. Although they are altering their strategy, they discovered that the cub has succeeded in making a tiny hole in the wall of the shed. End of chapter 27. Second part, beginning the shock, back at the cabin. Fortunately, it was too small to escape through, but as John was fixing it, he discovered something that made his blood scuff the wood. 2 uniforms that the bears manufactured with cold. New scratches. He gently called Sarah to point out the markings while we were away. The rest of the day strengthening the walls of the shed and putting in additional safety precautions, the mother bear appeared to feel. As nighttime descended, their anxiety kept her youngster near, and she listened attentively to every strange sound. In the wilderness, John and Sarah sat on the porch of the cabin and observed the shifting light as the sun sank behind the mountains, painted the snow in pink and gold hues, producing a scene that was almost serene yet heightened the tension in the air. Sarah abruptly stated, "You have to think like them. What might cause someone to break their typical habits?" During his years of observation, John thought about the question when he watched 2 ravens circle overhead. He had discovered that animals frequently altered their behavior before to major events that disrupt the natural order, catastrophes, or significant migrations. Perhaps they're not giving up on anything, he said. The ravens landed on a neighboring tree, their shouts resonating through the air, perhaps hinting to something larger. John and Sarah were sitting in reflective solitude in the Kasi premises of the Cultural Religious Library in Blue Fashion, woodland in the calm evening air. The weather radio crackled to life early, and everyone around them appeared to hold their breath, anticipating whatever change was coming. John paid close attention as he heard the automated voice warning of an impending winter storm system the following morning. Made breakfast while keeping in mind the expected snowfall and wind speed of this storm. Size may alter everything, both positively and negatively impacting their attempts to safeguard the bears. It's simpler to track when you join him at the kitchen table with a hot cup of coffee, according to our fave Sarah. While most people stay away from the backcountry during bad weather, she took a moment to look at the map, which had become a constant figure on the table, but it also implies that we won't have any emergency support here in case something goes wrong. The mother bear was, perhaps, sensing the impending storm. She became restless in the shed, her wounds sufficiently healed that she could walk a short distance, but she still gave it a lot of preference. The cub, sensing its mother's nervousness, had turned into more vociferous, its cries echoing across the chilly morning air. "We must protect," J.N. replied, mentally assessing his supply. "We'll need enough food if we're snowed in." Uriel didn't reply. Sure, she was debating what to do next. He put on his bulky winter coat and we walked beside the bears. "A general store is about 20 kilometers away, so I should..." Sarah nodded, but her face was worried. "Be careful, grab the radio and check in before the storm hits." She paused every hour before adding, "I don't enjoy the notion of splitting up, but..." The trip into town was tense, and John constantly checking his mirrors, conscious of every car on the road. He don't have many options. When he arrived, the general store on Rural Road was empty, with only a few residents stockpiling supplies before the storm. As he packed his pickup with goods, he saw some strange males at the petrol station across the street. Backcountry-ready heavy-duty vehicles within the store. Martha the elder, the owner who had been providing John's hut with supplies for years, drew him aside. "Intending to tell you," she said, looking around. "Last week, some people came in to inquire about you, claiming to be old acquaintances. But although they were aware that you had a cabin up there, they were unsure of the precise location." John's heartbeat increased, but he remained quiet. His demeanor was indifferent. "Thank you for informing me, Martha. Since you mentioned it, is there anything else odd going on?" She mentioned that when he was packing his groceries, there had been a lot of odd traffic in the city, but not the typical travelers purchased specialist equipment, heavy-duty chains, strange supplies, and on the journey back, John took a detour to ensure he wasn't being harassed by the people who asked him questions about the old logging routes. He radioed Sarah to give her an update after noticing that the sky had become black and that the first snowflakes were starting to fall. "According to Martha's intel, this validates our suspicions." Her voice crackled over the radio as they gathered. resources for anything significant, and John, I discovered something while you were away. When he got back, Sarah was waiting by the shed, her face somber, and she guided him to a location. Get back here as soon as you can. A tiny electrical device was partially buried in the fresh powder behind the structure where the snow had been disturbed. She clarified that the gadget is a tracking beacon and that they must carefully pick it up with gloved hands using military-grade gloves, had planted it while they were watching. James felt as much as he had when he had planted it that morning, and never in all his hunting experience had he witnessed something so. John was chilled by the implications, which had nothing to do with the falling, of precisely where the bears are. Sarah pocketed the device and remarked, Snow, why haven't they moved yet? I think they're waiting for something. She gazed up at the dense clouds, perhaps indicating a storm or the need for reinforcements. They spent the afternoon putting more insulation and storm-proofing the cabin and shed, so they would be prepared for anything. The bears kept a close eye on their activities, protecting everything that might be blown around by strong winds. The cub, while they worked, John tried to play with every tool and piece of equipment they brought close to the shed, observing Sarah's intent look, how she foresaw issues before they materialized, and her innate ability to exact desperation had been a positive experience. Having someone else here who shared his understanding of the forest was reassuring, who shared his dedication to protecting its wildlife. Just before sunset, a storm arrived, bringing with it roaring winds, and John and Sarah assembled their monitoring gear in the cabin among the deep snow, establishing a command center of sorts. On the kitchen table, the camera's night vision capabilities were still operational, displaying the operator moving back and forth. Seeing this, Sarah abruptly pointed to one of the swirling snowflakes outside and remarked, Look at this, screens. They could see orderly activity through the snow curtain. Deliberate movement. They're establishing positions by using the sea as cover. John, recalling his grandfather's lessons on reading the forest, he examined the movement patterns. He understood that we were setting up a perimeter, but they are remaining just out of our camera's range, so they are aware of our blind spots. The wind shook the cabin windows, and the mother bear's low, warning growl emerged from the shed. Sarah examined her radio equipment one last time when Cub fell silent, sensing the tension in the air. But the storm was disrupting the signal. So we're alone now, she added softly as she saw the snow accumulation on the windows. At least until the storm passes. Although warmth resisted the encroaching cold, it was unable to completely eliminate the chilly feeling of expectation that had descended. Outside of them, the storm continued to rage, offering ideal cover for whatever was about to happen in the shadows outside their walls. The night got darker as the storm grew stronger, changing the sweet murmur of setting, transformed into an unfamiliar, swirling white wilderness. Inside the Sarah and cabin, John continued their watch, alternately keeping an eye on the security apparatus and maintaining the howl of the wind was broken by the occasional creak of timber and the soft, comforting sounds of a wood burner burning. Sarah said, staring at the screens, The cameras on the north side of the nearby shed have gone dark due to the bears. The ice buildup, or she failed to mention the alternative. But John realized their rivals were astute enough to anticipate where to hit first, and a particularly powerful gust rattled the windows of the cabin when the power abruptly cut off, leaving them in complete darkness. John promptly ignited the emergency slashing cabinet. He had lamps ready, and their warm glow made the walls dance with shadows. When the backup generator started up on its own, they understood they needed to save fuel. So we should check on the bears. John claimed that putting on his bulky coat made the short trip to the shed seem like miles in the wind and driving snow. The mother bear was attentive and vigilant, and her youngster was tucked inside, trying to knock them off their feet with each stride. Sarah used lantern light to check the bear's healing paw near to her side. She muttered, more to herself than to John, I'm almost ready. A few more days, and if we could wait till then, she could go alone. A sharp crack. Instead of the sound of branches shattering, a more purposeful conversation between Jayan and Sarah reverberated through the storm. Back in the cabin, they tightened their defenses after spotting someone testing them with the sounds from the storm. The doors and windows using the materials John had bought from town, Sarah's training as a ranger, and John's experience in the wilderness praised one another while working quietly and effectively under the lantern light. "We should adopt their mindset," Sarah replied, laying out their chart on the kitchen table. "How would we go about taking the bears?" "Would be our strategy." J.N. examined the region he was familiar with, observing it from fresh angles that they would want to stay away from. He indicated a number of places where they would attempt to pull us away from the shed in any frontal confrontation. "These are our perimeter's weak spots on the map. Therefore, if I were organizing this, I would concentrate the radio there." Abruptly crackled, causing them to both leap through the static and just discern the words that someone was attempting to. Sarah changed the frequency to communicate, but the storm's interference was too heavy, so the screen became covered more by cracks on the wall, and Sarah changed the frequency to whisper. "Hopefully," she murmured. Strong could be backup finally getting through, although her look indicated she didn't truly believe it. Unbelievably, the hours passed with only the constant howl of the wind, and the buzz of the generator had grown to be a reassuring constant during the routine checks on the bears. But John knew they had to be. He had experienced enough winter storms to be ready for it to fail. Knowing that anything might occur during one of, Sarah stopped and put her palm on the door to listen, whispering through their shed inspections. There was a pattern to the storm's mayhem, with subtle movements in the dark that were too well coordinated to be random. Completely motionless, allowing their eyes to acclimate to the darkness. The snow had subsided a little, and in the fleeting periods of light they could see shadows moving through the trees in the clarity between dusts. The observers had turned into the observed. As they rushed back to the cabin, Sarah remarked, "They're using the storm exactly as we thought they would." John was ready to reply when a new sound broke through the silence. "But why show themselves now? They must know we've seen them." Hearts thumping, they hurried back to the shed after hearing the cub's frantic cry. The mother was pacing as much as her injury permitted while the cub was there. But the bears were still there. Something frightened them, so they cowered in the corner, John murmured. Looking at the shed's security, everything was undamaged. But the bears' actions were concerning. Before humans could see it, animals frequently detect a deadly risk. Sarah's ranger instincts took over. "Therefore, we need to put up She claimed that creating a plan beforehand gives them the impression that we are more vulnerable than we actually are if they decide to go. Let's decide where and when to move." They spent the following hour meticulously setting their trap, with their understanding of the forest and its fauna to produce a plausible scenario to inspire him. And by the end of the day, he was more convinced than ever that they would succeed, would last. Years of studying animal behavior proved crucial. Fortunately, the storm subsided as midnight drew near, and the wind lowered itself to a low groan in the comparatively calm atmosphere. The sound of the snow crunching, the branch brook, and the gentle hum of the branch bruck had considerably subsided, but she was still vigilant. She seemed to know what was about to happen as she kept her gaze on the shed door. "Look," Sarah muttered, gesturing through the swirls to one of the last operational cameras. They noticed a pattern of lights, not flashlights, but something more advanced, moving through the trees. After the observers had finished hiding, they were moving. Jane and Sarah exchanged a glance that showed they understood the night's true meaning. Everything they had planned for was coming to a head in the shed as the test was about to start, and the mother bear let out a deep growl, and the forest as a whole appeared to hold its breath in anticipation. The forest's light pattern started to move with exact synchronization. To build a pattern of what? The moon slid closer, and the sunset sky. What would happen next? Inside the cabin, Sarah and John observed what she recognized as a typical encirclement arrangement. When the observers' motions were tracked by functional cameras, the storm's intensity had decreased to a constant. Although visibility is somewhat improved by the snowfall, it is still difficult to see. They are utilizing military-grade night vision. When the first wave pushed against the storm's shores, the area was already filled with sea, already troubled by the first wave. Equipment that Sarah noticed, pointing out that the unique green glow seen from the cameras isn't typical. The movements of animal trappers are too well organized and regimented. John placed extra emergency lights all around the shed, forming overlapping light pools that would render any. Although more challenging, the mother bear stayed unusually composed, seemingly realizing the need for quiet time. Although she still preferred her youngster, her renewed strength was visible in the way she moved while keeping them near. "Healed Poe, we must set up our trap before they approach," John stated, examining the intricately constructed false trail they had developed, and applied their understanding of bear behavior to create the illusion that the bears had somehow averted it. After behind faint but noticeable evidence in the snow, after fleeing the shed and moving to a new location, Sarah agreed and took out her radio. Despite the fact that contact was still challenging, they might take advantage of the static. She started sending out coded communications, giving the impression that she was working with backup units that didn't truly exist. Anyone listening to this would find the formal language and terminology credible. "Might buy us some time," she said in a whisper to John. "If they think we have, they will reconsider moving in." Reinforcements in the area. Via the cameras they observed as the light patterns ceased, most likely because the radio transmissions were intercepted by observers, and the formation changed, indicating a shift in strategy. John and someone was testing the motion sensors that Sarah had placed around the perimeter, and now one of them was activated. The mother bear's defenses inside the shed caused her head to suddenly become more vigilant. Her actions validated the sensor's indication that someone was approaching by turning in a particular direction. Sarah's voice was tense, as she stated that they were probing our weaknesses from the north side, utilizing the woods as cover. She and JN have spent hours reiterating what seemed to be focus, but they are unaware that we have prepared for this. Susceptible spots, setting up covert traps that would alert anyone attempting to take advantage of them with a fresh sound that pierced the fall night. At first, a flawless rendition of a wolf's howl at night, followed by another responding cry coming from the other way. Wildlife sounds were being used by observers to communicate, but John's years spent in the outdoors allowed him to pick up on the subtle double meanings behind the patterns obtainable by the elephant. He stated, "They're coordinating their final positions, recognizing the differences from genuine animal calls." Sarah swiftly modified their defensive approach as the pattern prepared to move. "We must get them to think. Their strategy is effective. Let them stick with it before they discover it's a trap." She took a moment to examine the monitors. As we anticipated, they are dispersing into smaller groups, and the mother bear's deep roar gave another warning that although their technology was unable to detect the cub, she could sense movement. Sensing its mother's stress, it stayed remarkably motionless and silent, as years of nature had taught these creatures. When survival required complete silence, JN and Sarah moved to their designated spots, prepared to follow the details of their strategy. They had constructed several defense layers, each intended to appear more susceptible than it truly was. The observers would need to carefully consider their options, and each decision would provide additional information on their goals and strategies. Through the light snowfall, they could now see dark forms moving. The observers had given up some of their stealth as 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They moved carefully and precisely through the trees, possibly thinking their anticipation would be successful. They had the advantage due to superior numbers and equipment, and this overconfidence was exactly what John and Sarah had hoped for. As we watched the shadow's deliberate movement to split us apart, Sarah muttered, "They're trying to draw us out." She gave us a small smile in between threats. Although they are unaware that we have been playing this game. Since their arrival, the radio had been crackling once more, but this time it was transmitting clearly and professionally, voice asking for quick communication. Sarah looked into Jonk's eyes and said quietly, "If they ought to react, since this was the point at which their strategy would begin, and time was everything." John nodded. Realizing the stakes, they had planned for this and expected the observers to eventually attempt to discuss. But the observers were unaware that every moment of communication would benefit Sarah and John. Better comprehend the aims and positioning of their opponents in the shed. The widow's mother moved to stand between her youngster and the direction of the figures that were approaching. She was a powerful guardian because to her restored strength and protective instinct. But Jonathan and Sarah were aware of their actions. As Sarah reached for the radio in preparation to respond to the situation, her responsibility was to make sure she never had to use that strength. Transmission. John kept a close eye on the monitors, making sure that every action they took was flawless. The actual chess match was about to start, and they were strategically positioned to lead their opponents precisely where they wanted them to go. Sarah raised the radio to react after carefully placing all of its components. "This is Fish and Wildlife Service Officer Collins. Please identify yourself from the static." Her voice is steady and professional, crackled briefly before receiving a response. "This is Marcus Jensen. We recognize that you are caring for an injured bear and her cub on behalf of the Northern Wildlife Research Institute. Possess the necessary licenses and tools to move them to an appropriate location." John and Sarah exchanged shrewd glances. They have already confirmed that the Northern Life Research Institute did not exist. Investigations. The answer was well practiced. But it validated their suspicions regarding the tactics of their adversaries. "Please send your permission codes and permit numbers." Sarah responded in accordance with the usual procedure, while providing. John took the time to trace the source of the radio signals using the cameras, observing the change in the observer's formation. The mother bear stayed motionless, indicating their hesitancy, in the shed. Her eyes kept them focused on a single spot in the shadows, as her actions indicated. She could identify something about these people more than any technology, like their scent or the way they. Sensing the tension, Officer Collins pushed the cub closer to her. The voice came back with a faint edge. "Maybe we could talk about this face to face. We have a fully furnished transport van, and those animals require professional care because the weather is becoming worse." Han got thermoregulation, while JN kept an eye on the cameras. Standing by Sarah kept them conversing. The observers' positions were gradually shifting, utilizing the discussion as a pretext to approach, but they were precisely following John and Sarah's route. "Your concern is recognized, Sarah. I expected to unintentionally stroll into their meticulously planned defensive strategy," replied in a businesslike manner. "However, we have a veterinarian on staff. As part of a continuing inquiry, Route and the bears are under federal protection. I'll need to view those authorizations prior to permitting any transportation past the monitors," they observed, as a number of persons approached the fake. They were drawn to the trail they had previously made by the meticulously constructed snow tracks that resembled bear movements. John had created the decoy trail using all of his years of forest experience, far from the shed's true location. Persuading Officer Collins that the radio crackled once more. "We must demand that this mother bear for months as part of a bigger research effort." Interestingly, Sarah responded, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Because data is essential to our study. Would you mind providing an explanation? Our records show that no such research project has been filed in this field." While keeping her attention on the radio program, Sarah nodded in agreement with the facts. "Jensen, could you also clarify the unregistered traps we've encountered?" Approach. "We can disseminate our data via the cameras JN observed while the observers persisted in following the fraudulent. As they believed they were getting closer to the freed bears, their confidence grew. Stayed safely concealed, their existence concealed by the shed's ingenious use of light and shadow." Sarah's subsequent radio message was well planned. Mr. Lopez claimed he kept his phone on all night in order to keep watch over the bears. He was inhibited from speaking. "Jensen, keep put. Our backup units are nearly to eyes there. They'll be pleased to confirm your credentials here." It was a bluff, but one supported by their prior phony radio traffic. Had an instant impact, making the observers' formation less planned and more urgent. They could see statistics. Clearly reevaluating their approach, they conferred in the shadows. "Station 5 was falling apart," John added, gesturing with his arm toward one of the screens. "A new world." On the perimeter, a set of figures had emerged, each moving in a different manner. They had great strength, explosiveness, and forcefulness. "It's hard to believe," that such a creature, still moving in a pond, these movements were dramatically improved by doing things the right way. This is how we do things in bison. Both of them are acquainted with actual Forest Service tactical groups that use standard John your backup, whispered to Sarah, optimistic but unsure. As we approached structures, her gaze was attentive and she shook her head slightly. But regardless of who they are skilled professionals. Take a look at how the mother bear's behavior abruptly altered as they were going and leaving our friends toward the North Ridge. She lowered her warning growl to a low rumble, more intrigued than alarmed by something about these newcomers. Through the softly falling snow, she could sense that things were changing, like a difficult game of chess. The observers were obliged to adjust, since they were torn between their original strategy and this new development. Yet, because of adaptability, there was ambiguity, and John and Sarah had been trying to create the distraction. Newly coming figures glided through the forest with practiced efficiency, causing instant animalistic compulsions. Through the cabin's monitors, John and Sarah witnessed the initiation of the observers' meticulously planned activity as the shrubberies rapidly expanded. It ran out of people, and an early missile's arrival alerted the observers to the proper procedure. Newly coming figures glided through the observers' meticulously planned activity as the shrubbery backgrounds were cut away to set up cameras, and their synchronized motions became more unpredictable. Mr. Jensen Sarah spoke into the radio once more, her voice full with newly discovered self-assurance. "I see that your squad is backing off." The radio stayed quiet, but the activity suggested that perhaps now would be a good time to talk about those missing permission numbers. The observers were obviously taken aback by this development, as evidenced by their superior equipment and access to the information they very much wanted. With meticulous preparation suddenly appearing less beneficial, the newcomers proceeded to progress methodically through the trees. The mother bear's behavior had changed as a result of the trees in the shed gradually limiting the observer's possibilities. Suddenly, as if she recognized something familiar, the stress she had been feeling had subsided and she was attentive and almost at ease. Following its mother's example, the cub had ceased hiding and was now keeping an eye on the door in the scent of the intruders. John said in a quiet study, "Look at their equipment with curious interest. It looks like the old trail they followed, just as they did." "It's the same way. I think it is." Observes these newcomers. They are not wearing any of the typical Forest Service equipment, flashy, merely reliable, expert tools based on his years of service experience. Sarah assisted him in identifying the minor distinctions between real rangers and those attempting to mimic them, nodded while keeping her gaze focused on the screens. Whoever they are employing traditional containment techniques. This before she grabbed the radio once more, but a fresh voice cut through the static before she could send. "This is Ranger Thomas Martinez from the Regional Tactical Support Unit, Officer Collins. We apologize for being late. Your position is surrounded and guarded. Please wait for our approach." Verification revealed that the observers' movement changed abruptly and dramatically, disrupting their formation already, started to clearly retreat, as seen by JN and Sarah on the cams, retreating into the deeper forest. Their advanced machinery cannot compete with the straightforward effectiveness of skilled Forest Service employee. "Martinez," Sarah muttered, "I should have known he's been tracking illegal wildlife." A smile of recognition crossed her lips. Our radio traffic must have been picked up by activities in this area for years, who then deduced what was going on. The Kryptos, despite her recovering injuries, the mother bear's behavior indicated that she was instantly on her feet and moving with astonishing grace. She might have recognized the situation because she had previously come across these rangers during their training, the cub encouraged. By its mother's assurance, participated in wildlife monitoring activities. Started playing once more, falling in the newly strewn hay before Officer Collins Martinez's voice could be heard. "Once more, we're picking up several illegal frequencies in your neighborhood. It appears that our friends were using," Sarah answered professionally, "but military-grade communication technology is highly intriguing for a purported study team, Ranger Martinez." John could hear the relief in her voice as she affirmed that we've been observing their activities. I believe the monitors will provide you with a fascinating look at their research apparatus. They observed the Forest Service personnel carefully securing the area. Their motions were deliberate yet deliberate. The observers' retreat had gained more trust from seasoned experts who knew exactly what they were doing. Urgent, now that all of their previous bluster had vanished, John examined the screens while watching the last of the attack. He noticed that the lights of the observers vanished into the deeper forest as they approached the former fire road. But Martinez's team will take care of that. Sarah was already arranging for the incoming rangers to provide them. The professionalism of both parties was clear from the monitoring data they had collected. So, it's beginning to hurt a lot, Captain Harker. This wasn't just about stopping one set of wildlife traffickers, but in an effort to establish a case that would stop similar attempts in the future. The storm had nearly entirely receded, leaving a pure layer of snow that was captured on camera. Every action was well documented, and the observers' hasty retreat left them with a wealth of documentation, equipment that leaves no trace, and, most significantly, their advanced communication systems within the shed. The mother bear's defensive anxiety had been replaced with peaceful awareness as the environment changed. Cub's joyful energy came in full force. They appeared to realize that the threat posed by the humans moving had passed. John and Sarah went outside to speak with Martinez's family, and we are now there to defend them rather than to threaten them. Team, the clear night air brimming with the silent effectiveness of law enforcement professionals at work, the contrast between using X-IVE equipment, this operation, and the observer's previous attempts were stunning. Intimidation, but the other person was able to succeed with expertise, experience, and legitimate authority. You did a wonderful job here. Martinez claimed that as he walked up to them, his keen eyes were observing every aspect of their setup. But I must inquire, how did Sarah grinned and looked at JN, saying, "You managed to hold them off for so long. We had assistance. Sometimes the best defense is knowing the forest better than your opponents," she added simply, quoting Martinez. He looked between them and nodded, dawning in his eyes. It was no longer just about defending two bears. It had grown into a bigger example of how patience and wisdom technology and malicious intent could be defeated by reverence for the wilderness. The next morning was clean and crisp, with the rage of the storm gone and the wilderness reclaimed by new snow. The Forest Service crew had spent the night methodically recording the proof and protecting the perimeter. John saw from the porch of his cabin as the panorama was painted in gold and blue hues by the early sunlight. Sarah came out of a briefing with Ranger Martinez, her expression displaying both fatigue and contentment. More than we anticipated. She said she was having a hot cup of coffee with John, and those weren't just any wildlife. Traffickers left behind equipment worth millions of dollars, including state-of-the-art tracking devices of professional quality. Everything required for a large-scale operation, including transport equipment, inside the shed where the mother bear and cub had made their home. A calm morning ritual, the bear's recuperation had advanced wonderfully well, and she now moved with more assurance, her damaged POW hardly displaying any symptoms of the recent stress. Apparently undisturbed by the tension from the night before, the cub bounded about her. Martinez wants to do a full Sarah, kept observing the bears via the shed window today to check on their health. If everything appears to be in order, we may be able to begin organizing their comeback to the wild. The revelation caused John to feel conflicted about the previous weeks. He had become used to his peculiar visitors, discovering unforeseen happiness something in him had been aroused by their presence. The tranquil strength of the mother bear and the lively spirit of her cub discovered that sleeping provided a link to the living world that was more than just. Sarah clarified that they had been monitoring these bears for months, sharing the knowledge they had gained from the set. The mother bear is highly important due to her distinctive markings, and she is renowned for her capacity to move between different areas and adjust to varied conditions, which is uncommon and makes her cubs particularly ideal for certain private collections. John nodded, realizing that she is a survivor, whispered softly as she observed the bear guiding her baby through their morning routine and taught him all the house handoffs did. The Forest Service team had established a temporary command post close to the cabin in order to provide the necessary capabilities. Their presence they operated in a discreet and professional manner, practicing deficiency respecting the ranger. Martinez came up to them as they were gathering evidence and securing the location, despite the delicate balance of the wilderness. As he saw the bears through the window, his seasoned countenance conveyed satisfaction. "Your setup is amazing. Most people would have attempted to make this a fortress, but you saw something more significant, working alongside the forest rather than against it." Sarah grinned in recognition of the praise, saying, "We had a good teacher." Infant development. The forest tells you what it needs if you're prepared to listen, a young man stated, pointing to the wilderness surrounding them. With a tablet showing what looked to be thermal imaging data, the ranger rushed up to Martinez and they spoke. After a little period of silence, Martinez turned back to JN and Sarah and said, "There's movement on the North Ridge. However, the good news is that there is a population of wild bears up there, and their movement is regular. Patterns showed no indication that our unwanted guests were influencing their behavior, which was important information for wildlife. Trafficking activities frequently upset whole ecosystems, resulting in animals give up their natural habitats, despite the local bear population continuing to exhibit regular patterns." Began Poker said that they had identified the issue early on, since the cub had observed the action outside and was closely observing. Its mother stayed composed, despite its curiosity poking its nose against the shed window. TR in their company, as seen by her calm demeanor, she had changed from a scared, hurt animal into I would be a self-assured mother once more, prepared to resume her natural role in the forest. "Like to suggest anything?" Martinez mentioned that when comparing JN and Sarah, this place where you're set up is special. We've been searching for a modest method to make a more lasting impression in this area without upsetting the natural order. If you're willing, this might be the ideal observation station. The idea hung in the air, brimming with potential. John stared. His hut, which he had constructed as a haven from the outside world, has changed into something other and is no longer an invasion of. Sarah kept a close eye on him, observing his loneliness but also the evolution of its purpose. "Knowing the importance of the choice, it wouldn't require altering what you've created here," she said quietly. The mother bear had ascended and was standing at full height in the shed. He was standing at full height in the shed, extending its protection to a wider circle. Her healing was more than just physical. She had reclaimed her own self and her untamed dignity as the cub. As the day went on, John imitated her movements, learning and developing in preparation for their eventual return to the forest. He became increasingly interested in Martinez's proposal, and the Forest Service crew operated effectively. Their presence on his land somehow enhances, rather than detracts from the area's natural rhythm, moved with the tacit admiration of others who recognize the delicate equilibrium of the wilderness life we're considering. Sarah described laying out maps on the cabin's surface and referring to it as the Montana Wildlife Observation Project. Kitchen Table A system of key spots where humans can keep an eye on and safeguard wildlife without interfering. Your cabin would be the ideal first outpost for the mother given their natural routines. The Forest Service doctor who checked the bear and her baby verified what they had hoped. Both the animals were in great shape, and the mother's wounds had miraculously recovered because of their diligent care. The intriguing thing, the veterinarian said, was that she was resilient and received attention. This is how she has changed her mobility to safeguard the regenerating tissue. In fact, she has gained new abilities to learn to recover themselves. These animals are incredibly resilient. John observed this through the window. While the cub played in the new snow, its mother watched over its adventures with the compassion of an older sibling. John was looking out the window as the two slowly made their way to the snow. Comfortable yet attentive gaze. Both bears had an incredible metamorphosis, going from scared and damaged to powerful and self-assured, reminding him of his personal experience in these woods. Discovering solace in the basic rhythms of nature, the endeavor wouldn't just, Martinez noted, that joining them at the table is about protection. realizing that our ties to these untamed locations deteriorate with each season. However, the harmony you've established between nature and human existence is precisely what we need to preserve. Sarah extracted other documents that demonstrate the wider reach of their vision. We've found a number of important wildlife corridors that require monitoring are located in an ideal position that is far enough away to not be disturbed. The concept started to take shape in John's imagination when he realized it was easily accessible enough to act as a foundation for research and conservation initiatives. Once a haven from the outside world, the cabin may evolve into a means of connecting the wilderness and safety. To maintain his sense of solitude while making a contribution to a cause greater than himself outside of the Forest Service team, was meticulously recording all of the evidence that the animal traffickers had left behind. Each item contributed to a greater narrative about concerted attempts to take advantage of the wilderness, but also about the commitment of Martinez pointed to several places and said that people who worked to safeguard it would need to make some adjustments. Better communication systems and more monitoring devices surrounding the property, but everything created to blend in with the surroundings with the intention of remaining undetectable to wildlife and any possible dangers. Cub's mother watched with what nearly disbelief as Cub found a new activity that involved rolling pine cones in the snow and jumping on them. Amusement appeared to be totally recovered, her own strength restored, and they were prepared to go back into the wild. But their presence had permanently altered this location. But Sarah added something more. Her voice softer, that we'd like you to join the team as an active participant and not merely a place. Your understanding of, your knowledge of the local animals is invaluable. John reflected on his years of solitude and how he had come to these woods in search of escape, but instead he found meaning, and the bears taught him something valuable that is true. Finding the proper approach to be a part of the wilderness was more important than separating from it. Martinez made out a second map, this one depicting the larger area. These trafficking schemes are becoming increasingly complex. They analyze trends, employ technology, and take advantage of any vulnerabilities. They can locate it, but they don't get that the forest itself serves as our finest line of defense. Not against it. The sun was high now, and the snow in the mother bear's shelter was wonderfully reflecting its brightness. Rose once more and walked to the window overlooking the woodland. Her stiff posture had changed, the alertness of a threatened animal, but the self-assured knowledge of a wild animal prepared to re-enter her territory. You wouldn't lose this, Sarah whispered softly, as if she could read his mind. Solitude? We'd be enhancing the relationship you've established here by establishing a network of defense that complements nature rather than encroaching upon it. As though to highlight her argument, a pair of eagles flew above, their shadows gliding on the snowy landscape. The woodland was already beginning to revert to its natural rhythm after the disturbance of the night before. Long shadows were produced by the afternoon sun as the events faded like footprints in fresh snow. The Forest Service team had started working through the trees as John thought about the future developing in front of him. Initial setup for the observation project, with their efforts guided by the same meticulous regard for the outward. The three main wildlife pathways that we have identified and described are the wilderness that first drew him to these woods. Years ago, Mother Bear and her youngster had spent the day near her youngster when they pondered their problems. She'd spent the day near her youngster had spent the day in increasingly busy patterns that they had noticed. Regarding the bears, her eyes glowed with professional excitement because this is an important crossover site for several species. She described how the mother bear and her youngster had spent the day in increasingly busy patterns that they had noticed. Their movements during the veterinarian's examination of their enclosure demonstrated their increasing strength and confidence. One last inspection and confirmation from Med showed that the bears were prepared to return to their natural habitat. The veterinarian suggested taking final notes in her report on the weather, so tomorrow morning would be the best time for their release. Clear, and other bears are moving through the northern valley, according to our tracking, so they will have a natural route to follow. When John learned that the bears he was assisting had evolved beyond simply being wildlife, he experienced a range of emotions. Teacher's presence had changed his lonely life by giving him a fresh perspective on his place in this wilderness, transformation into something more abundant and interconnected with the forest's life force. Martinez came up with more thorough designs for the observation project, which we are considering adding solar-powered computers. He marked monitoring stations here and there on the map that are fully self-sufficient and made to mix in with nature. The key is that the natural environment will allow us to monitor movement patterns without upsetting the wildlife. Sarah noted that she understood John's worry about preserving the forest's natural rhythms. The integrity of wilderness, whatever we install, will be as non-intrusive as possible. Discovered through the window that the best defense is to comprehend and adjust to nature's own ways. They observed the cub trying to scale one of the hay bales, its motions growing more confident and well-coordinated, with the mother bear closely observed each attempt, providing silent direction through delicate gestures and gentle vocalizations was an excellent illustration of how nature teaches. Your time spent here will be crucial. Martinez went on to say that you comprehend something that no training program can impart, the actual rhythm of the minor alterations that indicate significant changes in wildlife behavior in these woods. The proposal started to feel less more akin to an expansion of what John had previously constructed here after years of silent observation. Though he was unaware of it at the time, the solitude he had sought had really equipped him for this role. Sarah provided further information on their vision for the project we're not looking at, which is the ideal viewpoint for this new objective. To establish a conventional research station, this would be a novel setting for observation and protection work. Your ability to live in sync with the natural cycles has demonstrated to us that the cub may have finally succeeded, as it celebrated its accomplishment by playfully bounding up the hay bale, while its mother looked on with what appeared to pride's recuperation was more than just physical. It symbolized how resilient nature can be when given the opportunity to recuperate. On its own terms, Martinez added his tone. There's more to know. Growing more severe, the data we've acquired here has enabled us to pinpoint comparable activities in other areas. What you and Sarah achieved here is already having a wider effect. John reflected about his grandfather's lessons regarding the forest, where each natural movement has an impact on the entire ecosystem after beginning as a basic. The act of aiding a wounded bear has developed into something more significant that could contribute to the preservation of the wilderness. Loved how the sun was setting and the bears were painting the snow-covered countryside in rich purples and golds. Bokoneti. Gotten used to their nighttime ritual, with the cub cuddling with its mother as they got ready for their final night together. The refuge, they would go back to nature tomorrow. But their impact would endure since they had sparked a new phase in the history of this location. Sarah smiled softly as she observed the bears. Remembering when I first saw you here with these bears, I never dreamed it would result in something like this. I thought I was just responding to another wildlife incident. Dawn introduced a completely novel method of protecting wildlife in the Montana wilderness by using a unique form of human life. The air was clear and pure, with the clarity that usually accompanies a winter storm. She leaned into the camera and brought up the display. The snow-covered environment remains unaltered, except for the natural footprints of animals starting their daily activities today. When marks the start of a new era for the forest itself, in addition to the bear's return to freedom, the bear appeared to understand the conversation, says, instead of marking time, importance of the morning as she went, with deliberate intensity to check on her cub, and reacting to the faint indications of the awakening forest that came through the walls of the shelter. The cub, detecting its mother's actions, revealed an exceptional intensity, as though she understood that Sarah declared that everything was prepared and that she would be joining John on the cabin porch with Martinez. Has scouts stationed throughout the Northern Valley to guarantee safe travel and timing for their daily morning coffee. Could not be more favorable, since they have observed multiple bear families traversing the region after the winter eating patterns. The Forest Service team made last-minute preparations for the discharge in a stealthy and effective manner, selected a path that would provide the bears with the most opportunity to return to their natural habitat, while persisting in her current training program. Her plans then were essentially reliable on the dogs. Every aspect of blending in with the current wildlife population had been thoughtfully planned to make the livestock business storm the fascinating thing the wildlife veterinarian said while she rehabilitated them. Her final health check determined how well they'd retain their wild instincts. We are concerned that animals may grow overly reliant on humans. Yet, as she watched the cub practicing, she grinned. Despite their climbing prowess, they never lost their genuine selves, and John grasped what she meant during their visit. It was evidence that bears had maintained their unique wildness while embracing human assistance without becoming dependent on it. Their tenacity, and possibly to the manner in which he and Sarah had provided their care, consistently honoring the distinction between Martinez's requested help and intervention, and his team provided the last information. The hallway is clean, and we've verified that there isn't any unusual activity in the area, and the other bears we're monitoring are acting normally, said Guerre. That's always a positive indication. As they get ready for release, nature has a way of letting us know when everything is in harmony. Sarah provided additional information regarding the observation project's progression. We'll start modest and only cover the most important. The objective is to preserve the natural balance you've established here, with routine patrols and monitoring devices. The morning light intensified its protecting effect, warming the air and forming a soft mist as the morning sun set the ground. It was time for the squad to take their positions, with each member understanding their role in this. Once the sun touched the snow, the bears would be given a clean route to the forest in a meticulously planned moment, with people placed only to John, and Sarah went to the shed for the final time to see the mother bear to make sure they were safe during the shift. Even in these last minutes of their joint journey, the CB remained close, her presence commanding respect. To her, its lightheartedness is balanced by the importance of the moment at hand. Sarah inquired quietly, but it looked like the bears JN and she were asking it for everyone. JN nodded and moved to open the feeding stations, hay, and shed door. Offering the bears their full and absolute freedom was what enticed them to return, revealed a spotless winter morning. The mother bear took a minute to look about, taking in the surroundings. John witnessed her majestic stance, which epitomized the majesty of the wild. The cub, completely free and dignified, awaited its mother's signal. The natural self-retreat that would help it survive in the wild with purposeful grace, the mother bear stepped. She stopped as she turned to face Jayan and Sarah one last time before heading out into the storm. Something in her eyes conveyed comprehension rather than thankfulness, because it was a human idea, but an acknowledgement of the part they had played in her return to freedom. The cub moved in a manner that mirrored its hum. Together, they advanced into the forest, their black shapes under the mother's influence. The change from confinement to freedom was occurring with the same stark contrast to the white snow, innate grace that pervaded all of their encounters with these amazing animals as the bears vanished into. There was a deep silence over the clearing as the forest's dark shapes melted into the shadows of the towering pines. This was the stillness of things coming into place, not the strained silence of the storm days before. The mother bear and her youngster confidently made their way to their native habitat, leaving their footprints in the newly fallen snow. John and Sarah saw the start of their new journey from their observation point. Nevertheless, the mother's regained power was visible in her as the bears made their way into the wilderness. They made rapid pace in the snow, with the cub lagging behind and stopping sometimes to examine intriguing smells or textures, as well as natural actions that demonstrated its quick adaptation to the freedom appearance. Through their binoculars, Sarah indicated movement in the distance with a whisper. The mother bear had previously seen that there was a welcoming committee of sorts, because they could see other bears in the valley, them modifying her course a little so that she approaches at the ideal distance, neither too close nor too far. showing the banana-eating subgroup had their intricate social awareness that Martinez's crew maintained over wild animals, their distinct locations along the hallway, their presence guaranteeing a secure transition. While being sufficiently remote, it was difficult for either group to mistake the other. Their radio transmissions arrived in gentle whispers, their wind-up greeting each other so that nature might take its time. "This is just the beginning," Sarah murmured, lowering her binoculars as she tracked the bear's journey without any hindrance. The bears ventured farther into the forest, and the lessons we've learned here will alter the way we think about wildlife. "Protection everywhere," John nodded, "not just in Montana. If the cause of it is understood, then we, you and I, will be able to better help its folks if we learn the lessons learned." Realizing that the relationship between people and wildlife has changed in a significant way during the previous few weeks, it was about protecting while honoring the natural order in his cabin, not about dominance or control. Once a retreat from the outside world, this new strategy was symbolized by the rising winter light, which caused the snow to... The woodland was coming alive with the typical sounds of moor bird song, the rust of feathers, and sparkles like scattered diamonds. Little creatures, the sound of the wind through pine needles, and nature's recovery of rhythm by combining the two. Later that afternoon, as the Forest Service crews started preparing the first returned bears into their never-ending dance, fragments of the observation network, John and Sarah made a final trek to the shed. During that period, the vacant building contained a few fur tufts and the echo of its most recent tenants. Sarah mentioned running, and the faint prints in the leftover hay recounted the tale of recovery and return. "When I originally received the tip regarding unusual behavior in these woods, I never thought it would be this. Hand along the wooden wall, often the best. Things we do aren't planned at all, they just happen as a result of reacting. The observation equipment that was being installed was small, discreet, and made to blend in with the surroundings. Solar-powered cameras, camouflaged as tree knots to capture the natural characteristics of the forest. Ground sensors that resembled common rocks, worked together in a system that honored the wilderness, and Martinez called everyone together for a last briefing as the day came to an end, because they needed to safeguard it. What you've began by stating, that the team that had been put together will serve as an example for wildlife protection throughout the... Understanding something and using its inherent rhythms is sometimes the greatest method to protect it, rather than... John stood on his cabin porch, watching the winter light disappear from the sky as nightfall drew near. It wasn't because the forest had changed that it felt different today, but rather because his solitude had transformed into... Sarah had a deeper bond with the wilderness that involved preserving it while respecting its untamed character. Passed him a cup of steaming coffee and said, "I received another report from the tracking team. The bears are right where they should be in the valley, having joined the other groups traveling through it." At a distance, a real wolf howled, this time with the genuine sounds of other wolves in the wilderness, reacted to their chorus, serving as a reminder that the forest was alive with innumerable tales, each of which had a role to play in the more natural harmony as darkness descended in the Montana wilderness. John discovered that his grandfather had been correct all along, and that the forest did contain mysteries that the contemporary society had forgotten, but they were actually facts as old as the mountains themselves, not secrets at all. Wild must be wild, conservation entails comprehension, and sometimes the best way to assist is to take a back seat. When nature took its course, the bears vanished, but their tale would live on. In the modifications they had sparked in John's cabin's new function, in the groundbreaking approach to wildlife protection they had contributed to, as well as in the greater comprehension of what it really means to coexist peacefully with the first stars to shine in the beautiful winter sky, their light bouncing off the snow-covered ground in the wilderness. John and Sarah started preparing the terrain for the mother bear and her youngster tomorrow, had paved the path for them, and now it was their responsibility to make sure that others would have the same opportunity to regain their freedom. Beloved listeners, we hope that they will find their place in the eternal dance of the wild. As much as it altered John and Sarah's lives, the journey across the Montana wilderness has touched your hearts. of the bears serves as a reminder that nature is wise and that it is our responsibility to preserve it while honoring its wild spirit. Click the subscribe button to see more stories that highlight the relationship between people and wildlife. Remember to hit the like button on your left and leave a comment below with your opinions. Every day we deliver. Multidisciplinary teams. Join us on this continuing journey through fresh stories that examine the delicate balance between society and wilderness. We look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments area as we continue our adventure of discovery and preservation.